Alicia Yamin leads Harvard's Global Health and Rights Project. She teaches at the Harvard Law School and the T.C. Chan School of Public Health, as well as being an affiliated faculty member at the Department of Social Medicine at the Harvard Medical School. Colombia's Constitutional Court recently struck down a law that had made abortion a crime, except in a few limited incidences. Could you tell us about that, please?
Sure. So the Causa Justa movement, which is a coalition of dozens and dozens of different groups, brought a case to the Constitutional Court. They were seeking the full decriminalization of abortion. Previously in Colombia, under a ruling by the Constitutional Court in 2006, abortion was only legal under three conditions. One, when the life or health of the mother was at risk. Second, when the pregnancy was the result of rape. And third, when there were congenital anomalies inconsistent, incompatible with life. So this broad social movement brought a case to decriminalize, expand abortion access in Colombia. And the court didn't decriminalize entirely, but went a very long way, decriminalizing it through 24 weeks of gestation. And importantly, those three conditions also apply after the 24 weeks of gestation.
Could you explain to our listeners what the difference is between decriminalization and legalization?
Sure. So decriminalization means that women cannot be prosecuted and providers cannot be prosecuted for providing abortions. Legalization means that the state will regulate the access to abortion under a number of different vehicles.
So what does this mean for disadvantaged women? Elite women have long had the privilege of just going to a private doctor and doing a clandestine but very safe abortion.
So I think that's a really important point, because we know that criminalization of abortion does not produce fewer abortions, and it really just drives them underground. And as you rightly point out, wealthy women, elite women, have access to getting abortions under safe and sanitary conditions, both within private clinics in Colombia, really, and also outside of the country. But the criminalization of abortion was really primarily affecting young women, disadvantaged women, women from rural areas that don't have that benefit. Now they will be free and available to women throughout Colombia.
That's a very important step. But what do you think the implications of this decision are for other countries in the region?
Well, this decision really has to be seen in the context of a larger green wave, which I think began in full with the legalization of abortion in Argentina through the first trimester up to 14 weeks of pregnancy in December of 2020. And that was done through legislation. And then in Mexico, just this last year, the Mexican Supreme Court decriminalized abortion as well in a very important decision. So this movement really needs to be seen as part of feminists and women's rights movements, but also LGBTQ movements across the region, claiming a deeper democracy. Latin America has been known for vast socioeconomic inequalities that are reflected in access to health in many ways, gender inequality, unrepresentative democracies. And this movement, I think, is more than just about a single procedure, reproductive autonomy, but really about claiming people's dignity and equality in society.
Could you talk to us a little bit more about the history of this movement?
There's a strong women's rights and feminist movement in Colombia going back decades and decades. But the Causa Justa movement was formed just a few years ago It's a broad coalition of civil society groups that include both local groups and providers, as well as international groups like the Center for Reproductive Rights and Women's Link. And the ruling in the Constitutional Court is, of course, exceptionally important, but they've also generated a social conversation around abortion. So they've brought this concept and question, which is so often in the shadows, taboo, stigmatized, into public debate. And that, I think, is also something that we learned from Argentina, because that's very much what happened in Argentina in the process of building a broad national campaign around the right to a safe and free abortion.
But Colombia has historically been much more conservative socially than either Argentina and Mexico. What kind of resistance did this movement face?
Oh, it faced steep resistance. I submitted a friend of the court brief in the case, an amicus curiae, and there were a flood of motions to, it's called an acción de nulidad, motions to deprive the court of being able to see this case. And I think there will continue to be steep resistance in implementation. I think we'll see challenges to the issuance of regulations and protocols in the Ministry of Health. So I think there absolutely will continue to be very sharp resistance. Politicians have come out since the ruling on both sides, frankly.
Could you walk us through a bit about how this might work on the ground, on how this resistance might affect a disadvantaged woman's ability to get an abortion, despite the fact it's been decriminalized?
Broadly in abortion law, what the formal law is only part of what determines women's access to the service. There are, of course, in the United States, for example, we have an enormous discrepancy between legal rights and access. Even before what looks like our legal access, our legal rights are about to change in a dramatically regressive way. But in all contexts, there are sort of informal rules. So as I said, before this ruling, there were these 3 exceptions to criminalization. But the interpretation of those exceptions can be really quite subjective. What is a threat to the health of the woman? Does that include mental suffering and mental distress, for example? How severe does a physical threat have to be? There can be all kinds of delays and bureaucratic hurdles. There can be background rules that affect how much information a woman gets. And often women don't know the circumstances under which they have a right to claim the abortion. So all of those background and informal rules very much shape actual effective access to the procedure. Because the formal law has now changed, that's not sort of like flipping a switch and all of those background and informal norms immediately fall away. There's going to need to be a massive amount of sensitivization and awareness raising and really different kinds of education and training of providers to see themselves as guaranteeing women's rights and the rights of persons who gestate and not gatekeepers on this procedure.
Do you have any sense of how this is playing out on the ground, whether this women's movement has put into place these kind of educational tools?
First of all, as far as I know, there have already been a few abortions. For example, at Oriéntame, which is an NGO, a pro-women's rights NGO in Bogotá, has already provided. So it is happening. And the Causa Justa movement has feminist physicians and providers as well who have been working within the health system for a while. But this is now going to take on a very different dimension in the advocacy and action.
There are now 3 major countries, Mexico, Argentina, and Colombia, which are giving abortion rights to women. What does this mean for the rest of Latin America?
Well, they're three of the most populous countries, and they're also three countries that often lead trends in the region. So I think we're going to see the green wave spreading. We've already seen some indications in Ecuador. I think in the Constitutional Assembly in Chile, we're going to see reproductive rights and then more work around that. And I would expect to see movement also in other countries around the region that are harder, right? Because this is a very contextual fight. But I would expect, depending on what the political configurations are in Brazil, I would expect to see movement there. Uruguay, of course, already has legal abortion the first trimester. Peru has a very strong and vibrant women's movement, but has had a very complicated, it's a conservative judiciary and a complicated political context. So I would expect to see that this is going to, move throughout the region and strengthen. And there are networks of both legal academics. There's a very important network called Red Alas of female feminist law professors and scholars that have helped develop comparative law and strategic arguments. The movements around abortion rights are also quite connected in the region, as are, of course, the anti-movements.
There are a few countries, particularly El Salvador, which have absolutely draconian laws regarding abortion. Do you think this green wave will have any effect there?
The short answer would be yes, I do, but maybe in a more indirect way. So the Inter-American Court of Human Rights recently issued a judgment in a case called Manuela versus El Salvador. And in that case, they found that the prosecution of this woman for infanticide, for what was probably a spontaneous abortion and then obstetric violence, was absolutely inconsistent with obligations under international law. After that judgment, a number of women who were being prosecuted in El Salvador have subsequently not been prosecuted. Right. So the green wave is not just a linear process of country by country, but there's a kind of plexus in which this argumentation is happening. And supranational forums like the Inter-American Court and UN treaty monitoring bodies are an important part of that. So I do see it having an effect in Central America, although in a somewhat different way.
That's very interesting. So you sort of, if I hear you correctly, have two tandem movements. One is the feminist green wave, and the other is a body of international human rights law. Is that correct?
So I wouldn't say they're in tandem. I would say they're deeply intertwined and recursive, and each of them affect the other in terms of strategic movement and
Yeah, many of our listeners are here in the United States, and I personally find it kind of ironic that as the United States increasingly faces growing restrictions on abortion, Latin America is increasingly knocking down barriers. Do you have any inkling on why this is happening, why this dichotomy?
Well, I think both of them, as I said, I think the green wave is really about deepening democracy in the region. It's not just about one service, one health service. It's about the health system as a social institution that reflects dimensions of social equality and inclusion, and women persons who gestate need to have access to the services they need. I think in the United States, we're seeing serious efforts to de-democratize, to restrict access to reproductive health, but also in many other domains, we've seen limitations on democratic rights in this country that, from voting rights to other kinds of healthcare for transgender persons, for example. So I think the two are quite related, and one is a very unfortunate trend toward de-democratization, towards exclusion of certain people as less than full members of community and society. And the other is a trend, a real effort, an initiative in a region, again, that's marked by very profound socioeconomic inequalities, to deepen that and expand that inclusion.
So you're on the board of directors of Women in Global Health. What other challenges are there for women, particularly for women in Latin America, in the near future?
I also, by the way, am on the oversight committee, the Proyecto Mirar, which does oversight of the legislation in Argentina that legalized abortion. I am on the international advisory board of the Argentine Safe Abortion Access Network, and I have family in Argentina, and I did my doctorate at the UBA. But in terms of what are the challenges that women face in Latin America, I mean, it is a profoundly unequal social context. I think we've seen in the pandemic that neoliberal policies that have been imposed for decades had a really profound impact, both in terms of COVID deaths, but also we saw the shadow pandemic, we saw displacement of access to sexual and reproductive health services. It's a region that has a very high prevalence of violence against women, sharp divisions in unremunerated care burdens, and women being more in the informal economy. So there are a number of different, what I would characterize as broadly political economy questions to really address for women to have gender justice in Latin America.
Do you see the Green Wave as championing any one of these issues, for example, political violence against women, as not after the abortion issue, but a priority together with the abortion issue?
Oh, it definitely has been. The Ni Una Menos movement in Argentina really was very synergistic with the expansion of abortion. And that was very important in Argentina in debunking this idea that people who support abortion rights are somehow a dissident movement or just a group of elitists. The Ni Una Menos movement to combat femicides and violence against women was a very, very broad, popular social movement in Argentina, and still exists, obviously.
So are you optimistic about the future of women in Latin America?
I am. I'm optimistic because women in Latin America are really showing that they are among the pioneers and agents of change in the region.
You've been listening to Alicia Yamin. She leads Harvard's Global Health and Rights Project. She teaches at the Harvard Law School and the T.C. Chan School of Public Health, as well as being an affiliated faculty member at the Department of Social Medicine at the Harvard Medical School. Thank you for taking time with us.
Thank you very much.
Es un gran logro, creo que con la decisión de hoy ganaron todas las mujeres, ganamos el reconocimiento, un mayor reconocimiento a nuestra ciudadanía plena, mayor garantía sobre nuestro cuerpo y sobre nuestros derechos sexuales y reproductivos.